good evening, Little Masters, and welcome to episode 123 of the Prancing Pony podcast, where tonight we'll vanish into a babble of voices and a cloud of smoke.
That's right, folks. We are finally headed to our namesake inn at Bree.
Yay!
And we will join the crowd in the common room shortly. But first, I'm Sean Marchese, the real-life Lord of the Mark, and I'm here with the man of the West, who owns neither a white apron nor a bald head, Alan Sisto.
Now, what does that remind me of? Oh, there, now it's gone again.
That's going to happen a lot.
Yeah, it is.
But it reminds me that it's time to do another Tolkien fun fact.
There you go.
Well, thank you for that music, my second favorite music in the Prancing Pony podcast catalog. And folks, we don't have to tell you that the Prancing Pony in Bree is more than an inn, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's a place to gather with friends and strangers for a good meal and a good drink, and it's a meeting place for the idle, talkative, and inquisitive from the four villages of Breeland and beyond.
Mm-hmm.
And Tolkien himself was no stranger to such places in his real life. I think many, if not most, Tolkien fans have heard of the Eagle and Child. That's
Right.
the public house in Oxford where the Inklings regularly met between 1939 and the early 1950s, I'm told.
Uh-huh.
Now, that pub is named for the crest of the Earl of Derby that's featured on the sign. It's a coronet with an eagle and a child. And it's also popularly known as the Bird and Baby. The Inklings usually assembled in late morning in the pub's small back room, according to Skull and Hammond.
Right.
Skull and Hammond also report that C.S. Lewis liked the place because of its traditional character, as well as its landlord, Charlie Blagrove. And you've actually been there, haven't you, Alan?
Indeed, I have. And the small back room is indeed quite small.
Really?
It's no longer the back room, as the pub has since expanded, and I have no idea who the landlord is. But I had a wonderful time visiting the pub, and I plan on returning each time I have the pleasure of attending Moot.
I hope to join you there someday.
I hope you do too, man. That would be awesome. Can you imagine?
I know. It would be so cool.
Yeah.
But I have not been there yet. However,
Right.
I do love this comment about the Bird and Baby from letter 113, which Tolkien sent to C.S. Lewis in 1948. He said, "I know no more pleasant sound than arriving at the B&B and hearing a roar and knowing that one can plunge in."
Oh, and yes, you can.
Sounds like such a fun place.
It is. Well, they're all like that, really, but I imagine that more than others, perhaps. But there's actually a story about Saruman himself, or Christopher Lee, and how he met Tolkien at the Bird and Baby in the late 50s. Now, you can find that story online because we don't want to digress too much. But look,
Yeah, that's right. We'll have to maybe put a link to that in our show notes to this.
That'd be a good idea.
But of course, there were other public houses and inns in Tolkien's life, almost opposite the Eagle and Child, and that's Skull and Hammond's words, and I have to trust them for the geography on this, is a pub called the Lamb and Flag.
Yep.
That's another public house that the Inklings met at starting in 1962, when the Eagle and Child opened their parlor to the public and joined it on to the main bar, which I think you were just referring to. That must have killed that privacy that they enjoyed in that little back room.
Yeah, well, and the Lamb and Flag is indeed just across the street. You don't have to just trust them. You can trust me.
All right.
Several of us ate there, actually, after the last day of Moot.
Oh, cool.
Late last year in October. Now, it's also crowded, just like every other pub.
Sure.
There's also the King's Arms in Oxford, close to the Bodleian Library. I had the pleasure of dining there with the always fascinating Harm S. from the Netherlands, one of the more knowledgeable Tolkien readers I've ever met.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. I know Harm.
And every once in a while, the Inklings would meet there at the King's Arms as friends for a drink and a talk, in the words of Roger Hensel and Green. In fact, in 1944, Tolkien wrote to his son Christopher, and this can be found in letter 79, "This morning I lectured and found the Bird and Baby closed, but was hailed in a voice that carried across the torrent of vehicles that was once St. Giles, and discovered the two Lewises and C. Williams high and very dry on the other side. Eventually, we got 4 pints of passable ale at the King's Arms, at a cost of 5 and 8. That's 5 shillings and 8 pence. I hope to see the lads tomorrow. Otherwise, life is as bright as water in a ditch."
The last little, clause there,
man,
notwithstanding.
Right.
Man, good times with friends and passable ale. Count me in.
Passable ale. I love that.
Good. The ale is passable. The friends are good. Better
than the other way around, I suppose.
That's the right priority. Yep.
Yeah, absolutely.
I don't know. Good ale and no. Passable friends. Let's see. So there were some other places in Oxford as well that the Inklings used to get together. The Eastgate Hotel is actually a hotel near Magdalen College that was converted from an old 17th century coaching inn, which is more or less what the Prancing Pony itself was. It was
Oh, yeah.
an inn with stables and rooms and food and drink for travelers. Tolkien and Lewis used to meet in Lewis's rooms in Magdalen on Monday morning and then take a drink together in the Eastgate. It was often favored by Tolkien for lunch or dinner when he had guests to entertain. And again, that's Skull and Hammond.
Right. Well, there's also the Mitre Hotel in Oxford. That's another former coaching inn from the 17th to the 19th century. It was one of the places the Inklings met during World War II. And there's even another pub in Oxford that the Inklings met in a couple of times in 1944 called the White Horse, which is not surprisingly another pub I ate at during Oxenmoot.
That's awesome.
Well, where else are you gonna? You gotta experience the history. I mean,
absolutely, yeah.
Not to mention the fish and chips. The White Horse, of course, is no relation to the Prancing Pony, I'm sure. In fact, none of these places can be said to be the inspiration for the Prancing Pony with any certainty.
Yeah, that does seem to be the case. Now, there is a place in England, not in Oxford, but elsewhere in England, that claims to be the real-world inspiration for the Prancing Pony, and some have said that it has a pretty strong resemblance to what's described in the book. That's the Bell Inn in Moreton and Marsh, Gloucestershire. The Bell is another former traditional coaching inn. It has 3 stories and many windows, just like the Pony.
Yep.
It has 2 wings running back. In Tolkien's time, they say they even had a wide arch leading to a courtyard between the 2 wings.
Oh, wow.
So very interesting there. Now, I actually reached out to the local Smile of the Tolkien Society there in Gloucestershire.
Oh, that's great.
Yeah, that's the 3 Farthingstone Smile, to find out a little bit more. I got an email back from Lynn Wilshire, a trustee of the Tolkien Society there, and Lynn said that their Smile does meet at the Bell, partly because there is a possibility that Tolkien visited there, but Lynn made it very clear that there's certainly talk of it, but no evidence.
Right. Well, even if there is no evidence for being Tolkien's inspiration, we certainly can't blame them for wanting to meet at a place that looks or feels like the Prancing Pony.
Totally. I mean, I would if I were nearby. So.
Oh, absolutely.
Now, for what it's worth, Lynn also told me that the Smile also meets at the Bull in nearby Fairford, where there is better evidence that Tolkien and the other Inklings actually did stay there near the end of 1945 when they were celebrating the end of the war. Lynn said, sadly, the hotel can't find the register for these years, but the story is pretty well documented in various biographies.
So if they're not at the Bell, they're at the Bull. Boy, they better make that real clear. That's what I'm thinking.
Are we meeting at the Bell or the Bull?
Yeah. Bull. The Bull.
Right.
What'd you say? No, never mind.
Right. Knowing how fast Tolkien talked, right? I mean...
Yeah.
So anyway, folks, that should give you plenty of Tolkien-related and Tolkien relationship, maybe, pubs and hotels for your next visit to England. And I just want to say thanks once again to Lynn at the 3 Farthingstone Smile for helping me get to the truth about the Bell in Morton.
Absolutely. And now let's head on into the real Prancing Pony and see what Barliman, the real Barliman, has for us tonight.
All right, let's do it.
And as usual, I'm going to start at the beginning for the obvious reasons.
Yes.
That's right.
I like that. I like how you did that. That's great.
Leaving it unsaid, man.
Mm-hmm.
All right, here we go. Bree was the chief village of the Bree land, a small inhabited region like an island in the empty lands round about. Besides Bree itself, there was Stattle on the other side of the hill, Coombe in a deep valley a little further eastward, and Archet on the edge of the Chetwood. Lying round Bree Hill and the villages was a small country of fields and tamed woodland, only a few miles broad. The men of Bree were brown-haired, broad and rather short, cheerful and independent. They belonged to nobody but themselves, but they were more friendly and familiar with hobbits, dwarves, elves, and other inhabitants of the world about them than was or is usual with big people. According to their own tales, they were the original inhabitants and were the descendants of the first men that ever wandered into the west of the Middle World. Few had survived the turmoils of the elder days, but when the kings returned again over the great sea, they had found the Bree men still there, and they were still there now, when the memory of the old kings had faded into the grass. In those days, no other men had settled dwellings so far west, or within 100 leagues of the Shire. But in the wild lands beyond Bree, there were mysterious wanderers. The Bree folk called them rangers, and knew nothing of their origin. They were taller and darker than the men of Bree, and were believed to have strange powers of sight and hearing, and to understand the languages of beasts and birds. They roamed at will southwards, and eastwards even as far as the Misty Mountains, but they were now few and rarely seen. When they appeared, they brought news from afar, and told strange forgotten tales which were eagerly listened to, but the Bree folk did not make friends of them. Let's talk a little bit about the chief village of the Bree land.
Let's do.
Yeah, we're going to start actually with you. You have some word nerdery on each of these village names, don't you?
I do, and this comes, as much of our word nerdery comes these days, from the nomenclature on The Lord of the Rings.
Yeah.
All of these place names, all of these names of these villages are elements found in actual English place names. So Bree, first of all, is from a Celtic word for hill. Stadel is from Old English stadel, meaning foundation. Coombe is apparently very common element in English place names. It means a deep but usually not very large valley, and it is from Old English.
Okay.
And then Archit is also from Celtic, and it means something along the lines of trees or the edge of the forest.
Huh.
Now, the use of the Celtic names particularly, Tolkien says, was to represent a stratum of names older than those in common speech or the Hobbit language.
Yeah.
Which makes sense, right? Because the men of this region, as we've just learned, they are the original inhabitants of this region going back to the First Age.
Yeah.
So their language is represented by Celtic place names, which actually would predate English names in England in the same way that the Breelanders predate the Dunedain or the Hobbits.
Absolutely. Wow, that's cool. I had no idea that he even went so far as to kind of create even older names in order to give this that history. That's neat.
Yeah.
I love that nomenclature, by the way. I know that we're relying on that a lot lately, and we have to because that's where the information is.
Yeah.
It's such a great resource.
I mean, you can certainly find information on this in other places. There's places like Ring of Words that have done a really good job of, bringing out some cool etymologies and things like that. But to get it in Tolkien's own words is pretty valuable.
Always the best place to go. Yeah, I agree. So we get a little bit about who the Men of Bree are. We understand that they're not affiliated with any other men. They're not part of some other group.
Yeah, I think not affiliated is an important. It's not that they're not related. I just want to make sure people are clear on that. It's not that they're not related, but they're not affiliated. They belong to no one. They're independent.
Yeah, and that's important.
Yeah.
We also get an interesting physical description. Not only do they have brown hair, but they're also shorter and they're a little bit broader than typical men, which, I don't know, you have to wonder if they're, I don't know, some sort of biological mix with maybe with hobbits.
With hobbits, maybe? Interesting. Yeah, maybe.
I don't know.
We're not told that they are, but it does kind of make you wonder when they're a little
Certainly
shorter.
They live together in the same town, so maybe that's, I don't know. That would be weird, though. That would be weird.
I don't know. When a man loves a hobbit,
When a man loves a hobbit.
You were right there. I'm glad.
It doesn't mind that she's short.
Wow, I'm surprised you knew the next line. I didn't.
I just made that up. But
okay. Well, I mean, I knew you made up the words. I thought maybe you had some.
I did.
I thought you had maybe some of the tune in mind. I don't even know.
Let's see. So they are friendlier with other races, though, and I thought that was interesting. It probably makes sense given that they're located at a crossroads, which we'll get to shortly.
Absolutely. Yep.
They're going to be a trading community. They're going to be interacting with people of various people groups. So that makes some sense. But I really like their origin story, this idea that they're descended from the first men who came into the West. Boy, that brings them back a very long way, doesn't it?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, again, back to the First Age, possibly descended from some of the Edain who never went to Numenor. Maybe not. They may not be from the actual three houses of the Edain, but probably related to them, like the way the Northmen were. I don't know.
Well, I mean, if they're part of the group of the first men that came over, then you kind of do think they're related to. I mean, maybe they were branched off before they became the Edain, because of course the Edain didn't just stop here in the Bree area. They ended up all the way into Beleriand. They
went farther into Beleriand, exactly. Yeah.
So maybe just some sort of offshoot of that group.
Yeah.
But that makes them ancient indeed. So much so that even when the kings come back, we're talking about then during the Second Age when the Númenóreans are coming back to the west coast of Middle Earth. The Bree men are still there, and now they're
still
gone.
there now. Yeah.
Pretty amazing.
Yeah. There's an interesting subtle commentary in there about their ability to just
to endure
to endure for that long.
Absolutely.
When so many others have risen and fallen, and they're just still there. There's a hardiness that's implied by that.
And especially considering they're so close to those former kingdoms of Rhudaur and Cardolan and Arthedain.
Yeah, that's true.
Those are all in that same region surrounding them in a way, and yet they managed to apparently stay independent during that time.
Yeah.
And I don't know how they managed to avoid the radar of the Witch King, but they must have.
Right.
Pretty amazing stuff. Yeah.
That's really cool.
But then we get the Rangers.
Tolkien has given us a couple of hints now about the Rangers.
Yeah, he has.
Now that obviously folks know that we're about to meet one. And now he mentioned it a couple of times at the end of the last chapter.
Right.
And now there's another one. And I love that even though it's clear that the Breelanders don't know who the Rangers are, where they come from, Tolkien gives us a very strong hint of who they actually are by mentioning the name Rangers, 2-3 sentences after talking about the kings from over the Great Sea.
Exactly.
Right? So that's kind of cool.
And the fact that they were taller,
mm-hmm.
Being very relevant to the men of Westerness. Yeah,
for sure.
But rarely seen. They are a hidden people, so to speak. Not quite like Turgon's people, but they don't make themselves known. But when they do, they bring news, and I would imagine their news is pretty interesting stuff.
I'm sure. I imagine it's not often good news.
No, probably not.
But yeah, interesting. I think is a good way of thinking of it, and also strange forgotten tales. There's this hint that they are preserving lore.
Yeah.
But the Bree folk didn't make friends with them. They're weird.
They're just too bizarre.
They don't quite trust them. Probably. No. They and we know that because we see it later. All right. So then we talk about the hobbits, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
I'm not going to.
I know we're not going to read that, but right.
They claim to be the oldest settlement of hobbits in the world, which you wonder, have they been around these Breelanders for so long that they just
we must have been around as long as you have.
Right, exactly. Or maybe they really were. Maybe they actually were there long before the Shire was colonized.
That could be. Of course, it turns out they mostly live in Stattle, but some in Bree, higher up the hill. I love this little line, though, about how there's this peculiar but excellent arrangement. The fact that they get along.
Yeah. It's great social commentary.
Isn't it?
Yeah. The way that they're each kind of contributing to the community. They're each necessary parts of the Bree folk.
Absolutely. They are, without both, they aren't the Bree folk. They're just men or they're just hobbits.
Yep.
Yeah. And then we get a little bit about their traveling. They don't travel a whole lot more than the Shire folk. Bree hobbits do go as far as Buckland, but Shire hobbits, of course, almost never visited Bree.
Right.
And they call, of course, them outsiders. But I believe we find out shortly that the Breelanders call the Shire folk outsiders
hobbits
too.
Outsiders. I know. Yeah. It's a great reminder of how other they each are to each other.
Absolutely, they are.
And
what today is probably like a 10-minute drive down the freeway.
Right. Exactly. Yeah. And I also like their little reminder that there's more of them than the Shire hobbits realize.
Yes.
The Shire doesn't have a monopoly on hobbitness, even though they might call other hobbits outsiders. There could be hobbits lots of different places.
Yes, there could. And there are.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, there used to be a lot of coming and going between the Shire and Bree, not so much anymore. But we know that the Brandybucks actually are related to some of the hobbit families in Bree.
Right, that's right.
So, yeah. Well, now we're going to get a little bit of a layout, the way that Bree is arranged and where it's located. And I'm going to go ahead and have you pick up about where it is near the road.
Okay. Down on the road, where it swept to the right to go round the foot of the hill, there was a large inn. It had been built long ago, when the traffic on the roads had been far greater, for Bree stood in an old meeting of ways. Another ancient road crossed the east road just outside the dike at the western end of the village, and in former days men and other folk of various sorts had travelled much on it. Strange as news from Bree was still a saying in the East Farthing, descending from those days, when news from the north, south, and east could be heard in the inn, and when the Shire hobbits used to go more often to hear it. But the northern lands had long been desolate, and the north road was now seldom used. It was grass-grown, and the Bree folk called it the Greenway. The Inn of Bree was still there, however, and the innkeeper was an important person. His house was a meeting place for the idle, talkative, and inquisitive among the inhabitants, large and small, of the 4 villages, and a resort of rangers and other wanderers, and for such travelers, mostly dwarves, as still journeyed on the east road to and from the mountains.
Excellent. Well, I know that I'd mentioned that this was going to talk about the layout and location of Bree, but what I just ended up having you read was where the inn is located. And I didn't realize that, of course, we weren't reading that bit about
Oh, yeah, that's right.
how
Yeah.
Bree itself is laid out. But that part that we skipped, the homes of the big folk are on the hillside looking west. On the west of the town itself was this dike and hedge. So the road comes in,
Mm-hmm.
goes south, and exits again. So you can picture the road going towards a hill. And right before you get to the hill, you cross a dike and a hedge. And then the
Mm-hmm.
road turns south and exits that same dike and hedge. So there's like a semicircular hedge that goes around the town.
Okay, there you go.
And then the road goes back south and then makes its way back around east again. So there's that nice little bend. And that hill is Bree. That hill is where the Bree folk live. So, that's,
I appreciate that
yeah.
that description, because that actually really is very clear in my mind, where I don't think I'd quite pictured it that clearly before.
It really is kind of a little bit of a challenge. There's a map, trying to remember where I saw it, that Tolkien drew of what Bree, the layout of Bree, and I'll have to see if I can find a link to that and put it in our show notes.
Yeah,
but
sure.
I have to say that the Lotro adaptation is pretty close in the
Really?
way. Yeah, it's that same sort of thing. The road goes straight west over through a gate. There's a little bit more action in the town than there is here, it seems. The inn is all the way at the very end of that road before it turns to the right. And then it goes right back on down, and there's a south gate. So you basically have just those two gates, and then the hill backing it up.
That's very cool.
Yeah. But I love this bit about the inn and the reminder of where Bree is geographically speaking, that it is at a junction of these two very important, or at least formerly important, roads.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
We learn obviously about the Greenway being grown over and abandoned. The fact is, it hadn't been that long. Strange as news from Bree is still a saying, and that tells us something.
Kind of get the feeling this is like an old Route 66 town, like it's on these big roads. That went all the way from the Greenway used to go up to Fornost Rhine, which is now called Deadman's Dyke.
Right.
All the way down.
All the way down.
If you look at the map, it goes all the way down through the Gap of Rohan and down to Minas Tirith. I mean,
it's the road.
This was the interstate for the Dunedain, basically. And
That's
Bree
right.
is right up here on this intersection of it and the road through the mountains. So
a
little bit of that. It's not what it quite once was, because the road isn't used as much anymore. But there's a kind of a cosmopolitan character to the town, which is neat.
Yeah, you're right. That's a good way of putting it. And of course, the inn is still very important, and therefore the innkeeper is very important.
Absolutely.
Anything called the Prancing Pony must be important, right?
Absolutely. Something that's worth your time and attention.
There you go. And if the innkeeper is an important person, the hosts must also be important persons.
Absolutely, yes. Those lads in the common room talking about the lore of the elder days, yes.
Well, our booths are certainly a meeting place for the idle and talkative. We know that much.
And inquisitive.
Well, hopefully. And of course, we also learn a little bit here that dwarves still come, but they're really the only travelers. You're not going to find a lot of elves dropping into the Prancing Pony.
No, they've got their own little places to stop.
A little too vulgar for them, a little too,
They'll stop at Woodhall and places like that, but
sure, of course,
or not Woodhall, but the Wood Hall, the actual Wood Hall they had in the.
I knew what you meant. The Hall of Wood, not the town of Woodhall.
Exactly, that's what I meant.
So I'm going to go ahead and read the arrival of the hobbits in Bree. Can't wait for this.
All right.
It was dark, and white stars were shining when Frodo and his companions came at last to the Greenway crossing and drew near the village. They came to the west gate and found it shut, but at the door of the lodge beyond it there was a man sitting. He jumped up and fetched a lantern and looked over the gate at them in surprise. "What do you want, and where do you come from?" he asked gruffly. "We are making for the inn here," answered Frodo. "We are journeying east and cannot go further tonight." "Hobbits? 4 hobbits? And what's more, out of the Shire by their talk," said the gatekeeper, softly, as if speaking to himself. He stared at them darkly for a moment, and then slowly opened the gate and let them ride through. "We don't often see Shire folk riding on the road at night," he went on, as they halted a moment by his door. "You'll pardon my wondering what business takes you away east to Bree. What may your names be, might I ask?" "Our names and our business are our own, and this does not seem a good place to discuss them," said Frodo, not liking the look of the man or the tone of his voice. Your business is your own, no doubt, said the man, but it's my business to ask questions after nightfall. And there's how we got the title of our
There you go, in case folks wonder.
Q&A. Yeah. Interesting. Of course, the gatekeeper looks over the gate, by the way, not through a tiny door and a massive gate. I'm just saying. Not that changes the core of the original. I'm just, pointing that out.
You're just pointing it out. Yeah, fair enough.
Of course. We don't read the rest, but there's this kind of foreboding comment about the pony having several guests, queer folk, as old Harry calls them.
Mm-hmm.
And
when he uses the phrase queer folk, I can't help but think about the fact that, as we were just talking about, I see Bree as a pretty cosmopolitan place.
Yeah.
There's a lot of different kinds of folk that come through there. If there's folk that are there now that they think are weird,
yeah, they must be really weird.
They must be really weird. Yeah, this is not like when hobbits say queer folk and they're talking about
people from Throgmorton, right?
Yeah, exactly. these are really strange people. So,
and we'll find out that indeed they really are.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
It's interesting. This is the first taste we get of old Harry not necessarily being a friendly guy. We'll find out more later. I don't know how much we talk about this in this episode. I think it's more in the next one, about some of Tolkien's plans for old Harry. I think that is in the next one.
I think that is in the next one. Yeah.
Yeah. So I just wanted to kind of plant that seed there, let you guys think about that. And we'll see what originally Harry was meant to be and what he did. And then what obviously Tolkien changed him to not do. So
very good.
All right, so I've got a passage for you to read before we move on to the inn itself. You want to tackle what happens here after they say goodnight to old Harry.
Okay. He wished them good night, and they said no more. But Frodo could see in the lantern light that the man was still eyeing them curiously. He was glad to hear the gate clang to behind them as they rode forward. He wondered why the man was so suspicious, and whether anyone had been asking for news of a party of hobbits. Could it have been Gandalf? He might have arrived while they were delayed in the forest and the downs, but there was something in the look and the voice of the gatekeeper that made him uneasy. The man stared after the hobbits for a moment, and then he went back to his house. As soon as his back was turned, a dark figure climbed quickly in over the gate and melted into the shadows of the village street.
Bum, bum, bum.
So ominous, isn't it?
I know, isn't it? I mean, I know we find out that it's not ominous, but it sure feels that way at the moment.
It absolutely does. You're reading this for the first time. You're like, oh no, who is this dark figure?
Yeah, is this one of the Black Riders? I mean, that's a dark figure, all right.
Right.
Boy.
But I think we can say who that is, right?
Well, yeah, we know that's Aragorn.
For everybody, that's Aragorn, yeah.
Nothing to be afraid of here.
As he's known.
Yeah. It's like that moment in The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy when it looks like bad things are going to happen, and then the narrator stops and says, it's very important to tell you all at this time that nobody gets hurt. Right? Remember? Like the worst injury anybody suffers is a bowl of petunias.
Yes. Yeah.
Except, of course, for that poor whale.
You're so on top of those Hitchhiker's references. It's been way too long since I've read that book, I think.
And yet it's probably been just as long since I've read it. I don't think I've read it in probably a dozen years or more. It's just that stuff has stuck with me.
It just sticks with you so much.
That's great. Time.
That's great.
I would read that. It was so much fun. I'd read it out loud even if nobody was around.
Really, that's
just
so
because
cool.
It was hilarious. The timing. It's all about the timing.
Yeah,
in that
it is. Yeah. That's what I should do next. Is the next time I read it, I should read it aloud.
It's very funny. A lot of fun. Marvin the Paranoid Android out loud is just comedy gold.
Yeah, I bet.
Here I am, brain the size of a planet. Anyway,
I thought Alan. Well, lest we digress too much, I thought Alan Rickman was a a pretty good voice for him.
I thought he was. Of course,
I know people have issues with that movie, and I understand.
Oh, I have a gazillion issues with that movie, but he did a good job voicing.
I enjoyed it for what it was, but but I thought he was one of the best things about it.
He was. He may have been one of the only good things about it. I know. But yeah. I mean, really, anything Alan Rickman did was done with incredible skill.
That is very, very true.
Yeah, we will miss him for sure.
Thor's hammer by the sons of Warvan.
They're miners, not miners.
All right, let's reel it back in, I guess.
But that's what we do. We digress. So
that's right.
We're going to learn, like I said earlier, we're going to learn more about why Tolkien has old Harry at the gate, kind of looking at them and wondering what's going on here and eyeing them curiously. We'll find that he's not an entirely good guy, but that's in the old version. Just like in the old version, Aragorn was Trotter and had wooden shoes and was a hobbit. In the old version, old Harry wasn't a very good guy, was a co-conspirator. But we'll learn more about that next time.
That's going to be a lot of fun. That's where some of those old drafts get really interesting. And,
Isn't it?
You know,
yeah, I agree.
They don't have, any bearing usually on the final text, but it's fun to see the things that Tolkien, the might have been.
Yeah, the progression. Yeah, exactly. And it helps, I think, especially as somebody who does any writing at all, it helps to realize that even Tolkien, the preeminent genius of our last century or two, still didn't necessarily know where he was going with things.
Right. Yeah.
It took him a while.
True.
Yeah.
It's true. It's very encouraging for anybody who wants to write fiction to read some of that stuff and to see how much trial and error he had to go through, how much figuring it out on the fly.
I think we learned that a lot in The Hobbit when we walked through Ratliff's History of The Hobbit and saw just how many changes it took to get what was, in essence, a very simple story.
Pretty simple story and pretty
Rings,
basic and not a very long story.
No.
But yeah, still the amount of work that went into it.
Yeah, all those drafts and revisions.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm going to go ahead and pick up here as the hobbits actually arrive at the Prancing Pony.
Yay.
The hobbits rode on up a gentle slope, passing a few detached houses, and drew up outside the inn. The houses looked large and strange to them. Sam stared up at the inn with its 3 stories and many windows, and felt his heart sink. He had imagined himself meeting giants taller than trees, and other creatures even more terrifying, sometime or other in the course of his journey. But at the moment, he was finding his first sight of men and their tall houses quite enough, indeed too much for the dark end of a tiring day. He pictured black horses standing all saddled in the shadows of the inn yard, and black riders peering out of dark upper windows. "We surely aren't going to stay here for the night, are we, sir?" he exclaimed. "If there are hobbit folk in these parts, why don't we look for some that would be willing to take us in? It would be more home-like." "What's wrong with the inn?" said Frodo. "Tom Bombadil recommended it. I expect it's home-like enough inside. After all, he gave it 3 stars on Yelp." I mean, really, I do want to see his review.
Meter.
Yeah, Introchaic meter, absolutely. Tom's Yelp review. Somebody, you know what? That's actually what we should do for tonight's closing gag. Send us your version of Tom's Yelp review.
For the Prancing Pony? Yeah, I like it.
I think we ask for their reviews, but I want to hear Tom's review.
Yeah.
Anyway, Sam, of course, imagined scary things, but this was scary enough. Interesting how he was willing to imagine himself facing off against giants, but the minute he sees a 3-story building, he's absolutely freaked.
Well, yeah, that's just too much.
Yeah. I mean, I don't mind a 30-foot tall person, but a 30-foot tall building just is too much. Yeah.
Well, there's something to be said about all these stories and all these windows and all those places for black riders to hide. I mean, that's kind of what he's thinking about.
Yeah, you're right.
I kind of get that, but yeah, it's very Sam, isn't it? It's pretty quaint.
It is. Quaint is a great word for it. It's very homey. In the Hobbit homeland there in the Shire, they don't build tall houses. They might build houses as opposed to holes in the ground, but when they do, they're long, they're low. They certainly aren't going to have 800 lit windows over a 3-story building. Right.
They're as close to hobbit holes as they could be.
Yeah, exactly.
While
just
still
above
being
the ground.
houses. Yeah. And this idea that he has of just looking for some hobbits to take them in, that says volumes about hobbits. And
boy, doesn't it?
I'm
willing to go knock on the doors of total strangers to see if they'll take us in, rather than go to an established inn that Tom says is a good place to stay.
Right. Yeah, that speaks to not only Sam's fear here, but also the fact that obviously this is not something that's too outlandish for a hobbit to do. I mean,
it's not unexpected to ask hobbits to put you up for the night.
Right.
Yeah. Something that probably goes on in the Shire all the time with people journeying.
Something that
near the road.
Yeah, I'm sure. And it's something that, I think would have gone on in simpler times in more rustic places. There's so much in old literature, medieval literature and things like that about, taking in guests and treating guests properly. So you can definitely see some of that there.
Yeah. I like, though, Frodo's response. It's essentially, I know we're joking about Tom's Yelp review, but really what Frodo is saying here, I trust Tom. I absolutely trust Tom. And if Tom said this is a good place to go, it's going to be home-like.
It's going to be a good place. Yep.
Remember Tom's house. Remember how home-like that was.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah.
And therefore, Tom's not going to recommend it if it's, a dive.
Right.
He's not going to recommend a place that isn't comfortable, home-like, safe for hobbits.
The Tom Bombadil seal of approval means something.
Absolutely. It's like a AAA 5 diamond or whatever it is.
Yep. I wonder if there's a discount. Is there a friend of Tom discount?
Friend of Tom discount? Yeah, 10% off rack rate,
Yeah. Yeah.
Nothing
fair.
Special.
No.
I'm sure if they booked online a week before with a non-refundable rate, they would have gotten a better deal. But they didn't know they were going to be traveling here.
That would raise so many questions as to how they did that.
Well, yeah, that and the fact that Frodo's credit card isn't under the name of Underhill.
So, that would be a red flag.
Yeah.
Excuse me, sir, this isn't you.
All right. So before we dive into, Frodo's, points system for his, how many points does he have at the hotel there?
His hotel rewards program.
There you go. That's what I'm thinking of. Right. Does he have enough nights? Does he have enough points for a free night with 4 hobbits? Anyway, before we get too distracted with that, there is, of course, the description of the hotel itself, which we're not reading, but it's got the front on the road. This is fairly traditional, right? Front on the road, 2 wings that go back towards the hill. Now, as the hill goes up, the lower slopes go, and at the back of the hotel, the higher level windows are now ground level.
Mm-hmm.
And then there's an arch to the courtyard between the wings.
Yeah.
With a door into the hotel itself, into the pub on the left.
And I think a lot of this description, as we're thinking about, the wings and the courtyard and all that, that's all very traditional for that that coaching inn style. That was really a big part of the infrastructure of England and I think other parts of Europe up until
certainly
the late 19th century.
Yeah, until cars started to become a little bit more of a thing, and which would have been more, I would imagine, early 20th. But yeah. So there's a signboard here, a fat white pony. That may be the only place where I've ever seen it described as a fat white pony, but I rather like that.
Yeah.
Perhaps we'll need to redo our logo and swell up the pony a little bit, make him a little more Fatty Lumpkinish.
Yeah. Why not make it, positive pony image and all that.
There you go. This is certainly not a Ferrari prancing pony.
Where
it's all long and lithe. Yeah.
No, it's a homey pony.
It is. It's a homey pony.
That's a very strange phrase. I'm sorry, but
it's a little too rhymey for me. But yeah.
Yeah, I know. I didn't mean that really, but
no.
It's got the same kind of aesthetic as everything else in this place, doesn't it?
It does.
The people of Bree are
down
not too tall, not too skinny.
You're right.
And
certainly Butterbur isn't. Yeah.
Right. Right. And I think we saw a lot of the men of Bree had that same kind of sort of build. And, I think it's simple. It's kind of a workhorse, a work pony.
Yeah. It doesn't say we're a fancy place with a fancy horse with with a thoroughbred. We've got a work pony here.
Yeah. And what an eye-catching logo it is. That's the kind of logo you want to use to brand your product, whatever it is.
Absolutely. No matter what you do, no matter what service or good you provide, using a white horse on its hind legs, it's a great idea, don't you think?
Get yourself a pony. Yeah.
Yeah, I agree, 100%.
We should do that someday.
We should do that. Well, then we get to before we meet them, we actually get this really cool moment where they're a little bit hesitant to go in, and then they start hearing somebody sing, and that gets them off their ponies, which I love that moment.
Oh, that's a good catch, yeah.
Isn't that neat? I mean, that finally gets them going, and they hear the laughter and the clapping, so they decide to go in, and that's where you're going to pick up, and we're going to get to meet our favorite barkeep.
All right. They led their ponies under the arch, and leaving them standing in the yard, they climbed up the steps. Frodo went forward and nearly bumped into a short, fat man with a bald head and a red face. He had a white apron on and was bustling out of one door and in through another, carrying a tray laden with full mugs. "Can we—" began Frodo. "Half a minute, if you please," shouted the man over his shoulder, and vanished into a babble of voices and a cloud of smoke. In a moment he was out again, wiping his hands on his apron. "Good evening, little master," he said, bending down. "What may you be wanting?" "Beds for 4, and stabling for 5 ponies, if that can be managed. Are you Mr. Butterbur?" "That's right. Bartleman is my name. Bartleman Butterbur at your service. You're from the Shire, eh?" he said. And then suddenly he clapped his hand to his forehead, as if trying to remember something. "Hobbits," he cried. "Now what does that remind me of? Might I ask your name, sirs?" "Mr. Took and Mr. Brandybuck," said Frodo. And this is Sam Gamgee. My name is Underhill. There now, said Mr. Butterbur, snapping his fingers. It's gone again. But it'll come back when I have time to think. I'm run off my feet, but I'll see what I can do for you. We don't often get a party out of the Shire nowadays, and I should be sorry not to make you welcome. But there is such a crowd already in the house tonight as there hasn't been for long enough. It never rains but it pours, we say in Bree.
Apparently we say a lot of things in Bree, because that's one of the things we'll notice is Bartleman is full of old sayings and
He
sort of
really
colloquialisms, isn't he?
He's got a lot of these little
Proverbs
proverbial
and,
adages and
good way of putting it.
Things, yeah.
Bartleman Butterbur, we finally meet the man, and his memory is already exactly what we thought it would be, which is to say terrible.
Yeah, that's why we should have never left him in charge of the mailbag.
I know, seriously. We should have left him in charge of, like, maybe the release schedule. I don't know when the next episode is, folks. You're going to have to ask Bartleman. Might be a week, might be 3 months. You never know.
He stole your line, though. Good evening, Master.
I think I stole his, but that's okay.
Did you? Okay.
Yeah.
He's so full of wisdom.
Oh, he is. He really is.
Anyway.
Oh, goodness. So we meet Nob and Bob, and then we get this next little passage here that I'm going to pick up.
Okay.
Well, now, what was I going to say? Said Mr. Butterbur, tapping his forehead. One thing drives out another, so to speak. I'm that busy tonight, my head's going round. There's a party that came up the Greenway from down south last night. That was strange enough to begin with. Then there's a traveling company of dwarves going west come in this evening. And now there's you. If you weren't hobbits, I doubt if we could house you, but we've got a room or two in the north wing, made special for hobbits when this place was built. On the ground floor, as they usually prefer. Round windows and all, as they like it. I hope you'll be comfortable. Oh, you'll be wanting supper, I don't doubt, as soon as may be. This way now. He led them a short way down a passage and opened a door. Here's a nice little parlor, he said. I hope it will suit. Excuse me now, I'm that busy. No time for talking, I must be trotting. It's hard work for 2 legs, but I don't get thinner. I'll look in again later. If you want anything, ring the handbell and Nob will come. If he don't come, ring and shout. And then I'm going to go ahead and skip a little bit and pick back up a few paragraphs later. I know this is a little long, but sometimes, it's Bartleman Butterbur. I've got to do what I got to do, right?
Absolutely.
So after he offers them something to drink and tells them where their bedrooms are, here's what we get next. They were washed and in the middle of good deep mugs of beer when Mr. Butterbur and Nob came in again. In a twinkling, the table was laid. There was hot soup, cold meats, a blackberry tart, new loaves, slabs of butter, and half a ripe cheese. Good plain food, as good as the Shire could show, and homelike enough to dispel the last of Sam's misgivings, already much relieved by the excellence of the beer. The landlord hovered round for a little, and then prepared to leave them. I don't know whether you would care to join the company when you have supped, he said, standing at the door. Perhaps you would rather go to your beds. Still, the company would be very pleased to welcome you if you had a mind. We don't get outsiders, travelers from the Shire, I should say, begging your pardon, often, and we like to hear a bit of news, or any story or song you may have in mind. But as you please. Ring the bell if you lack anything. So refreshed and encouraged did they feel at the end of their supper. About 3/4 of an hour's steady going, not hindered by unnecessary talk. Man, that's my kind of dinner.
That's just straight eating all the time. Yeah.
But we digress. That Frodo, Pippin, and Sam decided to join the company. Mary said it would be too stuffy. I shall sit here quietly by the fire for a bit, and perhaps go out later for a sniff of the air. Mind your P's and Q's, and don't forget that you're supposed to be escaping in secret, and are still on the high road and not very far from the Shire. All right, said Pippin, mind yourself. Don't get lost, and don't forget that it is safer indoors. And for once, Pippin gives good advice.
Yes,
we'll
indeed.
Soon see.
Absolutely.
I know that was a little bit of a long reading, but there were some really interesting things there. Yeah,
it's a good one because you get butter. You got to get a good
a lot
feel
of
for Bartleman Butterbur, and you get a lot of that in there.
You
do. Him leading them to the room and describing it for them. I thought that's all really cool.
Yeah,
I noticed just how comfortable this room is for a hobbit. It's small and cozy.
Yeah.
Which strikes me as very hobbit-sized. There's this fire. There's these low chairs, again, hobbit-sized chairs.
Yeah.
Tables already spread. And interestingly, the servant is a hobbit, which I think is significant. Remember...
Bartleman's a man, but Nob is a hobbit.
Right,
yeah.
Right, absolutely. And I think having Nob as a hobbit waiting on them serving them, whatever the word is. I think that's really significant. I think that's part of what helps them feel at home here. He's someone that they can relate to in a pretty strange place. I think that's really cool.
Certainly well, it's a strange place for all of them, though Merry probably feels a little bit more comfortable just because of some of his people having been here before.
Yeah, probably so.
But certainly Sam feels very out of place. And
yeah, definitely.
And I love being able to see this from his perspective, that this home-like nature of the room and the food and the beer.
And the beer, of course. Yeah.
Dispels his misgivings. I really like that. It puts us at ease, doesn't it? As a reader, it says, this is a place that's safe. This is a place we can trust.
Yeah.
Because they have good beer, they have good food, and they've got places that are designed specifically for hobbits. Like Bartleman said, these are very specific hobbit-designed rooms.
Yeah.
Which you'd have to do, really. If you're going to have hobbits as guests, you can't expect them to sit at a table made for 6-foot-tall men.
No, or sleep in a bed, or
or they have to climb a ladder to get into bed.
They'll do fine, and they'll fit in the bed, obviously, but they won't be very comfortable in it.
No. I guess it's better than putting a man in a hobbit-sized bed, but still. I've been at a few hotels like that.
Yeah.
Wait a minute. I'm not that tall. My feet should not be dangling off the edge of this thing.
Those are not the ones with the good Yelp reviews.
No, they are not. So I love this dinner, by the way. Hot soup, cold meats, blackberry tart. Doesn't this sound, this is good food. And like Tolkien says, good plain food, as good as the Shire can show.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's just like good comfort food,
Easy to eat, not a lot of prep, just sit down, you got your meats, you got your soup, you got your cheese, bread and butter, and a blackberry tart.
Yep.
And it takes them 45 minutes of no talking to get through this meal.
I love that. I do love that detail, that they just dive into it, and you can just stop. See. Yeah, they just do not stop. But
they get to
cool
business.
Stuff.
And it just, I think it reminds us of the priorities of hobbits, and food really is a priority.
Sure. Yeah.
And I think that's one of the things that we see really, really put Sam at ease.
This is a chance for them to feel like hobbits again. They've been on this adventure. It's far from over, we know, but
far
for them, it's got to have felt like an eternity, going through the forest and going through the barrows and all that stuff.
Almost being eaten by a tree, almost being killed by a white. Yeah. Pretty serious stuff.
That stuff will leave an impression on you. So it just for them to feel, to show how comfortable they feel now, that they can just be hobbits again, and they can just eat a good meal and just relax and enjoy good beer.
Yeah.
I think this is a great moment for them.
It is.
It's a pause in the action, but it's a great restorative moment for them.
Restorative. That's a good way of putting it. This is, restoration. This is recovery in a way.
Yeah.
If we're looking at it from the perspective of On Fairy Stories.
I'd say so.
Yeah. And then one more thing before you've got an interesting little bit on the mind your P's and Q's things. But before we get to that, I just wanted to observe something that I think we mentioned earlier, that Bartleman refers to travelers from the Shire as outsiders, just like the Shire folk refer to people from outside the Shire as outsiders.
Isn't that
that
cool?
parochialism again.
That is cool. That's a nice little thing for Tolkien to call out. And it tells us that these hobbits, our friends, our 4 hobbit friends, are strangers to the Bree folk as much as the Bree folk are to them.
Yeah. And it's really a man who says this too, not another hobbit. So this isn't just that hobbity parochialism. This is, something that, we see that on display even amongst the men then.
Yeah.
Interesting.
The Breelanders really are the most hobbitish people around, aren't they? The most hobbitish men around, aren't they?
Yeah. There's clearly more connection there between them than with any other group of men that we're aware of, at least in Middle-earth. Yeah.
And that could just be a result of the fact that they've lived so closely together for so long, and just a cultural cross-pollination there.
Absolutely.
Why not? If I lived near hobbits, I would want to live as much like a hobbit as possible.
Oh, you're not kidding.
Aside from the not traveling thing.
Well, yeah. Actually, I could probably even do with that if I had to. I'm kind of a homebody. Yeah.
I love traveling, man. I don't know. I would miss it.
I've come to enjoy it. I really enjoyed last year going to Oxenmoot.
I would be Mary. I would be like, the Mary who wants to kind of venture out and see new things. Yeah. But then I'd always want to go back home.
I'd probably be more like Bilbo. Like every once in a while I'd get a wild hair, but most of the time I just want to stay at home.
Yeah. Good book.
Yeah, absolutely. Mind your P's and Q's. You've got something on this, don't you?
Yeah, this just struck me as an interesting phrase to have in here. It's not an uncommon phrase in English. It means basically be careful, watch your behavior. It unfortunately does not have a really clear origin, but one of the theories on the origin of the phrase, which I'm going to preface by saying this is probably not where it really came from. This is probably just a rumor, but it's an interesting rumor as it applies to this. Some people have thought that this mind your P's and Q's might actually have to do with bar tabs and pubs.
Huh.
The P's might have originally meant pints and Q's might have originally meant quarts. With the proverb, mind your P's and Q's, mind your pints and quarts being...
I can just see Pippin's eyes getting really big now. It comes in
quarts?
pints? No.
It comes in quarts?
Oh, good golly.
Yeah, right. Exactly.
I mean, whoa.
Right.
No. Yeah.
That theory would say that the proverb is either advice to the landlord not to mix up the totals. So like when you're marking each one on the final tab, don't mix up your P's and your Q's, or it's advice to the customer to keep track of how many you've drunk. Again, that is probably
unlikely.
Completely apocryphal. In fact, the phrase seems to predate actually.
If it was
even being
mind your pints and cups, maybe.
Yeah, but who gets a quart of beer?
I
know, exactly. I mean,
heavens.
Maybe a pitcher or something, but yeah, I know but it is one of those common theories about it, even though most lexicographers say it's probably not true. No. And I think regardless of whether it's true or not, I think it's interesting that Tolkien could be playing with the false etymology here, because Merry is cautioning his friends to be careful in general, but also I think
don't drink too much.
Don't drink too much.
Which is good advice.
And I think that to me is more interesting than the actual origin of the phrase, is the idea that Tolkien might be playing with this probably false theory,
erroneous meaning, right?
Yeah,
or origin, I should say. Yeah,
I think that's a lot of fun, because
that is,
these hobbits probably do need to be reminded not to drink too much in this situation.
I think probably most hobbits need to be reminded not to drink too much.
Sam and Pippin have been wanting a beer for a really long time.
Yeah, that is true. Shortcuts make long delays. But inns make longer ones.
Inns make longer ones.
So they're going to, the three of them at least, are going to go into the common room. And what happens when they get there, Sean?
As soon as the Shire hobbits entered, there was a chorus of welcome from the Breelanders. The strangers, especially those that had come up the greenway, stared at them curiously. The landlord introduced the newcomers to the Bree folk so quickly that, though they caught many names, they were seldom sure who the names belonged to. The men of Bree seemed all to have rather botanical, and to the Shire folk rather odd names, like Rushlight, Goatleaf, Heathertoes, Appledore, Thistlewool, and Ferny, not to mention Butterbur. Some of the hobbits had similar names. The Mugworts, for instance, seemed numerous. But most of them had natural names, such as Banks, Brockhouse, Longholes, Sandheaver, and Tunnelly, many of which were used in the Shire. There were several Underhills from Staddle, and as they could not imagine sharing a name without being related, they took Frodo to their hearts as a long-lost cousin.
That's awesome.
I know, it's great. The Bree hobbits were, in fact, friendly and inquisitive, and Frodo soon found that some explanation of what he was doing would have to be given. He gave out that he was interested in history and geography, at which there was much wagging of heads, although neither of these words were much used in the Bree dialect. He said he was thinking of writing a book, at which there was silent astonishment, and that he and his friends wanted to collect information about hobbits living outside the Shire, especially in the Eastern lands.
Decent cover story.
Yeah, it's not a bad cover story. It's the kind of cover story that people aren't going to ask too much about because they don't really understand it.
Right, That's true.
I love that, they're wagging their heads about history and geography, but like none of them
going,
really.
What's history? What's geography?
Right, exactly.
I've heard about it every now and then. What's this history thing that you speak of?
Don't
and it's
know
one
much
that
about
keeps
history. Sorry.
Oh, that's terrible. Don't know much geography.
Yeah, see?
Don't know much about Shire folk.
Nice.
I can't. I wish
we
I
could
could
do
keep
a
going.
whole parody song of that.
We'd have to write it though, because I'm trying to wing it, and I'm not winging it very well.
Yeah, don't do that. No, this is not whose line is it anyway.
No, which is good because I don't have that particular skill.
Right.
I like the cover story because it keeps the attention off Frodo. I mean, once he said this, now they're just wanting to tell their stories.
That's a good point. Yeah.
He wants to collect information, so they're going to give him information instead of prying him for information.
That is a very, very good point.
This is a smart first move.
Mm-hmm.
It may be the last smart move he makes for the evening, but we'll get there in a minute. But I really think this is a pretty wise effort on his part.
That's a very good catch. I hadn't thought about that angle before. That it keeps them talking about themselves.
Exactly.
And, I like that.
And that's a conversational skill that I've Well, I'm frankly yet to master. It's very easy for me to talk about all the things I'm doing, or you know what I mean? I hate doing that too. I really envy those who have that amazing capability of making any conversation about the other person. It's a gift. And it's
you're
really
just
the way it
such
ought
an
to be.
interesting guy that you've got so
No.
much to share with the world.
It's that I just can't stop talking, frankly, Sean. I think you know that. I think after 3 years, you know that, right?
I think we all know that after 3 years. And that's why we keep tuning in every week. And that's why I'm here every week. But no, it's a good, another thing. Now, I said that joke about you being interesting. That's another aspect to it too. Right. No, I didn't mean it like that. No, I didn't. It's another aspect to this cover story of Frodo's, though, because it implies that he's less interesting than they are. Again, right. It keeps them talking about themselves and keeps them less curious about him just in general, because, well, I'm not interesting. I'm collecting information about other people, Yeah. I just think that's neat.
It is. Clever little solution on his part. Mm-hmm. Now, do we have anything on all the Hobbit names?
Yeah, a little bit. One thing that I noticed is that all of these names, it's interesting. They're called natural in the text. Yeah. But all of them are specifically puns on digging under hills or underground. Yeah. You've got banks, which comes from bank, a steep slope or a hillside. Sand heaver, that's fairly descriptive.
Yeah. Tunnely. So tunnely.
That's pretty
even
fun.
More descriptive.
Yeah. And even Brockhouse. Now, I think we talked about this some episodes ago. I can't recall for sure, but yeah, Brock is an Old English word for not. Actually, it is Old English, but it's an archaic English word for badger.
Right.
And badgers.
I know we talked about that. I just don't remember when.
I can't remember when. I know, but I believe it is from the Old English word for badger. Mm-hmm. And basically, badgers live in these things called sets. They're complex networks of underground tunnels.
Okay.
And so even describing someone as a Brockhouse, that makes one think of a tunnel underground that a badger would live in.
You're right. Yeah.
What's funny about that to me is not just the names themselves, which are hilarious, especially Tunnely.
They're very, Tunnely is right. A little on the nose there, Professor.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it sounds like a very ordinary name, like, Donnelly or something like that. Yeah. But it's Tunnely. Mm-hmm. What's funny to me about that is the fact that they're called natural in the text. Yeah. The men's names are botanical, but the Hobbits'
which is
names
also
are
natural.
Right, exactly.
But they don't. Right, he identifies them differently.
Right, the Hobbits' names are natural. Well, these dirt names aren't any more natural
than
objectively than botanical names. Right. I think calling them natural is more of a value judgment. I think basically what he's saying is that those are normal names. Those aren't odd names like those botanical names.
Oh, I see. Natural as opposed to unnatural.
As opposed to unnatural or abnormal.
Or unusual, right.
Mm-hmm.
Interesting.
It's very subtle, but I think that's kind of what's going on there. Like, those names aren't natural, but these names like Banks and Brockhouse, those are natural names.
Don't turn me into anything unnatural. Like a thistle wool.
Or a rushlight.
Definitely not a fernie.
No, we don't want to be a fernie.
So Frodo's cover story works the way he thought it would, that everybody starts telling him stories, people telling him all sorts of things. If the text even tells us if he really did want to write a book, he would have learned enough for several chapters almost right away. He ends up not writing anything. They sort of abandon the conversation and he sits by himself. And that's exactly where I'm going to pick up. The men and dwarves were mostly talking of distant events and telling news of a kind that was becoming only too familiar. There was trouble away in the south, and it seemed that the men who had come up the Greenway were on the move, looking for lands where they could find some peace. The Bree folk were sympathetic, but plainly not very ready to take a large number of strangers into their little land. One of the travelers, a squint-eyed, ill-favored fellow, was foretelling that more and more people would be coming north in the near future. If room isn't found for them, they'll find it for themselves. They've a right to live same as other folk, he said loudly. The local inhabitants did not look pleased at the prospect. Yeah.
There's a lot more here than there seems, isn't there?
I agree.
At the risk of saying...
I know, at the risk of falling into that rut of there's a lot to unpack here.
Yeah, right. Yep.
To fill our listeners in on that, we recently had our first Discord episode. That is, our listeners who are part of the Fellowship of the Podcast joined us on Discord. And we caught a little grief for some of the things that we say.
Some of those things that we say all the time. Like
I said, good stuff.
Definitely. Or.
Yeah.
Or that's fascinating. That's
And one of the things we apparently say is, there's a lot there, isn't there?
yeah.
Yeah, I guess that's a reminder that we're less professional than we thought we were.
Yeah, right.
You're right, though. There is something there. Yeah.
I've gotten to where when I say something is fascinating, even when I'm not recording the show, I feel like I'm just being disingenuous now. Like I'm not, that's really fascinating. I really do mean that. I'm sorry.
Yeah,
I don't just
I know.
I say that all the time, but it's because it's true.
It doesn't mean it's not true just because I say it all the time.
Right.
I mean, you know.
One of those things, man.
Yeah.
I mean it every time I say it, I promise.
Yeah. And there's a lot here too. Even though we say that a lot,
there is a lot to unpack here.
And it's a single paragraph, but there's some interesting things.
Mm-hmm.
And I know you've got some word nerdery. Actually, we both have a little bit of word nerdery on this whole squint-eyed, ill-favored fellow.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, this is something, well, Hammond and Skull pointed out that our American usage of squint, which is something that you and I are both familiar with, as we'll get into in a minute, means to narrow one's eyes, to make them more like a slit.
Right.
And in fact, in our episode about race in Middle-earth that we just released recently as episode 114, we actually did cite this term, squint-eyed, as one that's potentially racially offensive, even if Tolkien didn't mean it that way.
True. And a couple of our listeners, Helen and Linda H., who's an eye doctor in Ontario, told us that word doesn't mean what we thought it means.
You keep using that word.
We keep on using that word. I do not think it means what you think it means. In ophthalmological texts of the early 20th century, and even in Britain today, the word has a very different meaning, which Hammond and Skull corroborated. And before we do that, though, I have to really come down hard on Sean for making me try to say ophthalmological.
You handled it like a champ. You did.
I mean, I've done some medical stuff for VO where I've had to use really big words, but
that's what I'm trying to do. I'm just trying to help you grow professionally.
I appreciate it.
But so, yeah, in reference to this different meaning that it has in Britain that Hammond and Skull mention, they tell a story about how an American woman wrote to Christopher Tolkien to ask about the use of this word. And his response, which is actually provided in Hammond and Skull's Reader's Companion, was this. He said, "Just as you had never heard until recently of the use of the word squint to mean anything but to narrow the eyes, so I had never until your letter heard of that meaning. I believe that squint in English always carries the idea of obliqueness. A squint is a strabismus, a muscular disorder that causes the eye to look obliquely. And to squint means to suffer from that condition, but more generally to look obliquely, to look out of the corner of the eye. It can thus very readily come to connote character. Just what my father meant to convey by the squint-eyed southerner at Bree, I'm not sure. The likeliest meaning, I think, is that the man didn't look straight, but obliquely, watchfully, sideways, suggesting craftiness and crookedness."
Boy, that does mean something radically different than the way we...
Very different, yeah.
And it certainly even takes away some of the racial connotation that I think we assumed was there.
Absolutely, and I'm actually really glad to have this additional context because...
Yeah, that really does change the meaning,
Yeah, it really does, and I think it's important to have, as I said, I think it's important to have this kind of context and know what it means. I think it means something more like what we might mean when we say somebody is shifty-eyed or something like that.
Yeah.
This is kind of how I'm reading this now.
I think you're right. That looking obliquely, looking sideways, and the suggestion of craftiness and crookedness is certainly different than how I would have imagined it.
That doesn't mean that if somebody interprets it in a racially offensive way, that they're wrong to interpret it that way. If that's what you get from it,
your application,
right? If that's what you get from it, and if that's troubling to you, as it has always been to me in the past,
sure, of course,
then that's okay. That's your reading of it, and I think that's valid. But again, it's important to know what Tolkien meant by it.
Exactly. Yeah, I think that is. I, though, was focusing more on the end of that, what this ill-favored fellow had to say. His threatening comment about finding room and a right to live, this really was interesting to hear. And it is another thing that Hammond and Skull note. They mention, and rightly so, I think, that this is a very strong echo of the claim of the Germans to Lebensraum, to living room, to justify their invasion of Poland. This was written shortly after Chamberlain would have come back for his negotiations with the Germans. And it's a term that Tolkien would have heard prior to writing this whole idea of living room, of Lebensraum. And that certainly sounds like exactly what this guy's talking about.
That's
If we
interesting.
can't have this at peace, we're going to take it.
Yeah.
Because we have a right to find as much room as we need.
That's interesting.
I don't think we're talking here about war refugees yet, because the war hasn't broken out.
Yeah.
There is no open war at this point. So
Right.
they're not, this isn't like, oh, these poor war refugees, we need to find a place to house them. That's not what this is.
Mm-hmm. Right. Yeah. That's interesting. I mean, is it sort of the ideological murmurings of a guy who is thinking about invading, or is part of a group that's thinking about invading in the future?
Who is he affiliated with?
Oh, yeah.
We find out later on he's affiliated with Saruman.
Yeah.
So yeah.
Right. Absolutely.
It is that. It's absolutely that.
But was Saruman thinking of invading up here? I don't think so. Was he?
Well, I mean, he ends up taking over the Shire eventually. I don't think that's where his primary focus is. I think he's already working his will there, though. We know that he's already...
No, that's true. He's already got his clutches in the Sackville Bagginses.
He's got clutches in the Sackville Bagginses. Yeah. He's already bought up all this land.
That's true. And there are other ways to invade besides through military force.
Flat out military intervention, right? You just buy a bunch of land and then it's yours.
Yeah, I think you're right.
It's just an interesting...
Very interesting.
It's a subtle thing. And, at first glance, you think, well, of course, everybody has a right to live same as other folk, but where are they coming from? They're not...
But again, that context, I mean...
Yeah.
What... Yeah, if you just take that out of context, it just sounds like an innocent thing to say. But when you know a little bit more about what might have been in Tolkien's mind...
When you realize where the Southerners is coming from, you realize there is no open war, this isn't a refugee. You realize that this is a ripe and fertile land that is guarded only by the Rangers. Only is, that's kind of an understatement, but still.
Right, sure. Yeah.
And that Saruman has his eye on it, quite heavily. And certainly the Southerner is under his influence. So, yeah.
That's very interesting. It does take on a much more sinister tone that way.
In fact, I believe, I have to double check this, but I believe that this squint-eyed, ill-favored fellow is the same guy that in the Hunt for the Ring, the Nazgul run into on the road back as they're going up. He's coming back, and they grill him about Saruman.
Oh,
do you remember the portion I'm talking about?
I do remember that, and I don't have.
I'd have to look it up for sure, but I'm fairly sure that's who we're talking about here. So yeah, due to the magic of technology, I actually paused it long enough to confirm I was right. Which is pretty cool. That's rare enough that it's worth noting.
Even a broken clock, man. Yeah,
twice a day. I'm apparently I'm a 24-hour clock because I'm only right once a day, but this is that time.
This is pretty cool too. I'm glad you found it.
Yeah, it's just as I was starting to think this through, I'm like, wait a minute, I think this is the guy, and he is. So we get in the Hunt for the Ring, and this is another version of the tale. First of it, I'm just going to kind of summarize these paragraphs that Saruman had taken this interest in the Shire. He liked the leaf and needed supplies, but wanted to keep it secret. He wanted to extend his power, especially into Gandalf's province. So then he ended up into, getting his claws, as you said, into the Sackville Bagginses. Then he was wondering, why is there such a guard upon it? So he starts to get information, people in the pay of the Bracegirdles and the Sackville Bagginses. Then it says, but his agents were men of Dunlandish origin. And then we go on a little bit further. Some while ago, one of Saruman's most trusted servants, yet a ruffianly fellow, an outlaw driven from Dunland where many said that he had orc blood, had returned from the borders of the Shire, where he had been negotiating for the purchase of leaf and other supplies. Saruman was beginning to store Isengard against war. This man was now on his way back to continue the business and to arrange for the transport of many goods before autumn failed. He had orders also to get into the Shire if possible, and learn if there had been any departures of persons well known recently. He was well supplied with maps, lists of names, and notes concerning the Shire. This Dunlanding was overtaken by several of the Black Riders as they approached the Tharbad crossing. In an extremity of terror, he was hailed to the Witch King and questioned. He saved his life by betraying Saruman. The Witch King thus learned that Saruman knew well all along where the Shire was, and knew much about it, which he could and should have told to Sauron's servants if he had been a true ally. The Witch King also obtained much information, including some about the only name that interested him, Baggins. It was for this reason that Hobbiton was singled out as one of the points for immediate visit and enquiry. The Witch King had now a clearer understanding of the matter. He had known something of the country long ago. Remember, we were asked about that in a Parliament's Bag question not too long ago.
That's right.
Hey, shouldn't he have known? Well, he had known something of the country long ago in his wars of the Dunedain, and especially of the Tirn Gorthad of Cardolan, now the Barrow Downs, whose evil wights had been sent there by himself. Seeing that his master suspected some move between the Shire and Rivendell, He saw also that Bree, the position of which he knew, would be an important point, at least for information. He put therefore the shadow of fear on the Dunlending and sent him on to Bree as an agent. He was the squint-eyed southerner at the inn.
There you go.
Ha ha ha! So
That's awesome.
Wow, I'm glad I remembered that.
This wasn't just some ruffian. This
is a guy just days removed from basically being in the Witch King's service.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Wow.
And, having formerly been a, Saruman's man.
Having been, sort of having turned from Saruman's service to the Witch King's service.
Yeah.
And,
to save his skin, but yeah.
Yeah. Wow. And giving information to the Black Riders about the Shire.
Yep. Yeah.
I mean, this guy is the reason that the Black Riders made it there.
That's absolutely right.
Wow.
It puts that statement in a lot more context, doesn't it?
Yeah. Yeah, it does.
No longer do you think of him as some poor, unfortunate refugee that we just don't like the way he looks. No.
Yeah.
No, not at all.
Wow.
So,
yeah. That's a really good catch. I'm so glad you found that.
I am too, and I'm glad I was actually right.
Don't get used to it.
I know. Well, no, I'm done now. I'm not going to stick myself out anymore because I know that the next time I do, I'll be wrong.
Right.
I'll say something like, he could see through a brick wall in time, Elrond said about Aragorn.
Yep.
So, yeah. Anyway.
All right.
So the hobbits weren't paying much attention, right? We're not going to read that, but.
No, it's just pub talk. I mean, it's just something you overhear. You're not paying any attention to.
Well, and they figure they're not going to have to put up any of these big folk because they're not going to live in hobbit holes.
True. Yeah.
But they're looking instead to just engaging with the hobbit folk about the events in the Shire, and you get Pippin telling some funny stories, but then you get a little questioning.
So much for minding his P's and Q's. I mean, he's just he's not really giving a lot of information here, but still, I just got to feel like talking too much about the Shire, it's just going to make people start thinking about the Shire and then start asking questions about them. And that's exactly what Frodo's trying not to do.
If Pippin's talking about big Shire events that generate a lot of talk, so he's talking about the collapse of the roof.
He's talking about the mayor,
What's the next thing he's going to talk about? Bilbo's birthday party, right? I mean, there's another story. We don't want to talk about that, do we? No, we don't. So,
well, though that's old news by this point.
That's true. That is true. It's 17 years old at this point. Yeah. You're right. I keep forgetting films.
It's easy to forget that in the text because it's.
I know.
But yeah, I mean, it's. But yeah, still, by talking about the Shire, he's making people think about.
It's bringing stuff into their consciousness. Oh, that Shire, those crazy stories that always come out of the Shire. Hey, remember that one about Bilbo Baggins?
Yeah. Because inevitably it will turn to, oh yeah, do you remember that guy Bilbo? Well,
Baggins.
His cousin Mad Baggins, his cousin Frodo recently, left. It's just not like Pippin's going to say that, but still, it's just bringing their attention back to the Shire is the opposite of what Frodo's trying to do with his cover story.
Exactly. So what happens while he's getting a little worried?
Well, I'll tell you.
I bet you will.
Suddenly, Frodo noticed that a strange-looking weather-beaten man, sitting in the shadows near the wall, was also listening intently to the hobbit talk. He had a tall tankard in front of him, and was smoking a long-stemmed pipe, curiously carved. His legs were stretched out before him, showing high boots of supple leather that fitted him well, but had seen much wear and were now caked with mud. A travel-stained cloak of heavy dark green cloth was drawn close about him, and in spite of the heat of the room, he wore a hood that overshadowed his face, but the gleam of his eyes could be seen as he watched the hobbits. "Who is that?" Frodo asked, when he got a chance to whisper to Mr. Butterbur. "I don't think you introduced him."
There you go. Well, we're going to do a brief sidebar on Trotter. We'll talk about Aragorn next episode, but this really is a perfect time to talk a little bit about what might have been. For quite some time during the composition of The Lord of the Rings, Frodo didn't see a strange-looking, weather-beaten man. Instead, he saw a queer-looking, brown-faced hobbit, and that hobbit was known as Trotter. Now, in The Return of the Shadow, which is the 6th volume of the History of Middle-earth, Christopher Tolkien writes, "It would obviously not be true to say that there was a role to be played in the story, and that at first this role was played by a hobbit, but afterwards by a man. I would be inclined to think that the original figure, the mysterious person who encounters the hobbits in the inn at Bree, was capable of development in different directions, without losing important elements of his identity as a recognizable character, even though the choice of one direction or another would lead to quite different historical and racial identities in Middle-earth. So Trotter was not simply switched from hobbit to man, Rather, he had been potentially Aragorn for a long time, and when my father decided that Trotter was Aragorn, his stature and his history were totally changed, but a great deal of Trotter remained in Aragorn and determined his nature. Interesting stuff, huh?
That is very interesting. And it kind of tells us that he, I think I need to parse that a little bit, because he's
it's that last little bit there. He'd been potentially Aragorn for a long time.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it sounds like, obviously, Tolkien didn't have fully developed the idea of Aragorn or what he was going to be or the role that the Dunedain would play. And I think we knew that already. I mean, that would be somewhat obvious. But the idea that there was still something of Aragorn in Trotter, but it wasn't just a 1-to-1. It wasn't just a switch from Hobbit to man. It was basically changing Trotter to Aragorn completely changed the direction of the story.
No, absolutely.
I think is kind of the point of that paragraph, which makes a lot of sense, obviously.
Yeah.
It would
because
be
I can't imagine Trotter
story.
marrying Arwen.
I can't imagine Trotter becoming king of the reunited kingdom of Arnor and Gondor.
No, I can't either. No.
But it's interesting how this change sort of led to the grander epic story that we end up getting. Oh
yeah, absolutely.
This could have just ended up being a much smaller story if we'd just been left
another Hobbit-like story, really.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
I mean, bigger in scope, but
but still, like the Hobbit, focused on smaller people, probably in a smaller realm. Yeah,
probably.
But there were elements of his identity that ended up being switched to Aragorn, and I think that's fascinating. It's interesting to see the way Tolkien worked. In some cases, you look at something like Bledorthin becoming Gandalf in The Hobbit, and that's basically just a name switch. It's the same character.
Yeah.
But then you get these other things, Trotter to Aragorn, and it becomes a very different character and takes the story in a very different and I think unexpected direction.
Absolutely. But it's a direction that we're going to have to pick up next week, because I intentionally ended the show on that particular cliffhanger.
Nicely done.
We'll meet that Longshanks fella next week as we conclude at the sign of the Prancing Pony.
Now, before we reach into Barliman's bag, we want to remind you about the fellowship of the podcast.
Yeah.
If you've been listening recently, you've heard us talk about how close we were to our next goal of setting up a Discord server. And if you've been listening to this episode, you know that we now have that server up and running. Our listeners had been waiting way too long for our private humiliation, and they finally said, okay, we're ready for this thing, and we gave it to them.
Yep. But to keep that embarrassment amongst friends, the Discord server is limited to patrons at the Gift of Gondor level or higher. So if you want to listen in live during an episode recording, hang out with a couple of dozen or more of your patron friends while you're in there, then check out patreon.com/prancingponypod. You'll also get all sorts of other goodies like access to exclusive content and PPP swag. And check out our next goal, which surprisingly we're not that far from, of setting up a monthly live hangout with us on Discord. A chance not just to listen in, but to sit and chat with us all together with just a couple of your friendly neighborhood podcast hosts.
And I'm really looking forward to that one. I got to say, that's going to be a lot of fun.
Our experience on Discord, just with the chat channel being in text, was just a great time.
It was just a lot of fun.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah. Well, if you're looking for a new Tolkien book, check out the official library pages at our website, theprancingponypodcast.com, where we've put together a set of links for our listeners to all the books we've ever mentioned on the show, Tolkien or otherwise. And if you wouldn't mind posting a review on iTunes, we'd be grateful for that. That increases our visibility, which means more new listeners, more great questions for Barliman, more discussion on social media, and a more vibrant Tolkien community.
And speaking of social media, it's very helpful if you share us. Facebook, Twitter, Reddit, Instagram, wherever. I really can't think of all the places that Tolkien fans would hang out, but wherever they are, find them and let them know about us.
Other platforms that we're just not cool enough to know about?
Well, that would be just about all of them, Sean.
It's very true.
We're too old for all of them.
We hang out on Facebook with your grandparents.
Yeah, I'm surprised it's not MySpace. Please don't share us on MySpace. I think that's a waste of time.
Please. Yeah.
Maybe AOL. I don't know. CompuServe? Maybe? I don't know.
The old AOL chat room. Sorry.
Oh, man,
Didn't mean to derail you there.
No, you really did. Now, with that terrible, terrible discussion of social media, it's time to see what old Barliman has in the mailbag for us. Sean.
All right. Well, for starters, we've got a comment from Zach T. in reference to episode 113. This goes back to the Old Forest. And when Zach sent this in, it was a lot more recent. But between our recording episodes ahead of time and all the mailbag stuff we've had on Tom and Goldberry recently, this is just the first chance we've had to get it on the show. So sorry about that, Zach. But Zach commented on our question about why the hobbits in The Lord of the Rings have tinderboxes, while Bilbo had matches in The Hobbit. Zach said something interesting. He said, "You mentioned that Bilbo ran out of matches in The Hobbit, and I think that is the very reason that the 4 hobbits don't take them in The Lord of the Rings. If dwarves don't have them, the most skilled craftsmen in the world, it is probably safe to assume that only the hobbits have matches in the story. Therefore, once they run out, they would be out. My understanding is that a tinderbox would be easier to refill on the journey, and therefore would last longer. This is an example of the more prepared nature of the hobbits in Lord of the Rings, compared to Bilbo leaving without even a handkerchief, and shows that Merry and Frodo have really listened to Bilbo's story and learned from it."
And the practicality of a tinderbox was also brought up by Al W. on Facebook, who said that modern bushcraft enthusiasts still use flint, striker, and tinder. Matches. Tinder, isn't that an app? No, anyway.
Don't share us on Tinder either.
Certainly not one I know of. I mean, other than just reading news articles, just be clear. Matches are usually...
You read Tinder for the articles. Of course you do. That's what he says.
Well played. Well played. No, I've read news articles about the functionality and some...
I see.
All I look at that, I read those articles and I'm going, thank God I've been married for almost 27 years because I don't want to deal with it. Right?
I know. I cannot imagine being in that world now. It's
being swiped. I don't want to be swiped, man. That's just not cool.
No, that is not cool.
I'd rather be friend zoned than swiped. That's just awful. Anyway.
Yep.
So completely destroyed Al's quote. I'm going to try that again, that modern bushcraft enthusiasts do still use flint, striker, and tinder. Matches are usually permanently ruined if they get wet. Flint and striker will start considerably more fires than a box of matches and can become wet without suffering damage. And the tinder will still need to be dry, but unlike matches, will not be ruined by water. Bilbo was not at first a practical outdoorsman, whereas Sam is as practical as they come. I think Sam would have known the value in a tinder box, and Bilbo would have just used the convenience of matches. I think the professor may have already known this also, and if not, would certainly have learned it as a soldier.
That is so awesome.
Oh, yeah.
I love those insights from both of those listeners.
Spot on. Yeah.
I didn't know anything about tinderboxes until now, which is probably just further proof that I don't get outside enough.
Yeah, I haven't earned a merit badge in 39 years. So yeah.
In Flint and Tinder. But Zach and Al piqued my interest with their insights here, and I did go look up some stuff about it. It's really interesting. What I've learned, if my sources are accurate, is that the flint and the striker do have a really long usable life. They're just
right.
The flint is a stone and the striker is steel.
Yeah.
Now the tinder is the part that burns and has to be refilled as you use it. But as Zach suggested, you can actually use a lot of things as tinder to refill your tinderbox. There's dry grass, shredded cloth, leaves, or anything else.
Your co-host's hair. I'm sorry.
If your co-host had hair, you could
use
it.
There you go. It would be a very small fire. Anyway.
Mm-hmm. But yeah, a lot of things that can be found in the wild a lot more easily than finding a drugstore that'll sell you some matches.
True.
And in any event, like Al said, if matches get wet, they're ruined. And that's a really important practical consideration.
Absolutely. In fact, I think that settles it quite nicely. Naive little Bilbo thinks matches are a good idea because his idea of adventure is very, very small. It's kind of like ours, clearly. Sam, on the other hand, who's heard of Bilbo's adventures, is a little bit of an outdoorsman himself, clearly knows better and has learned from Bilbo's experience. So, great stuff. Thank you, both of you.
Yep.
Now, next up is a question from Michael B. He says, I think my favorite parts of both The Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit are the times that characters spend in the woods. More than any dark enemy or vicious orc, the wood passages seem brilliantly laid out to evoke a sense of dread and mounting paranoia. I'm curious if there is anything in Tolkien's real life which led to his repeated writings of incredible imagery of forests and the fear of being lost in the woods. Sean?
Well, I'm reminded of one of my favorite quotes from Reverend Lovejoy on The Simpsons, if you remember him.
Why, that sounds like rock and or roll.
That's the one,
no,
but that's not the quote.
No.
It's the one where he's talking to Ned Flanders and he says, short answer, yes with an if. Long answer, no with a but. I guess I would say there was sort of something in Tolkien's real life that inspired him, but probably not in the way you're thinking, Michael. What I'm thinking of is that we know Tolkien loved trees, and he hated the the so-called progress that was leading to deforestation across England. And we see this time and time again in his letters. I mean, letter 165, where he says, "I am obviously much in love with plants and above all trees, and always have been, and I find human maltreatment of them as hard to bear as some find ill treatment of animals." You got letter 241 to Aunt Jane Neve. That's where he's telling the story of how Leaf by Niggle was actually partly inspired by a huge poplar with vast limbs that Tolkien could see through his bedroom window. And he loved it. And there was the woman next door actually wanted to cut it down, and he had some very harsh things to say about her.
Mm-hmm.
Letter 339 to the Daily Telegraph, which we quoted a few episodes back in the Old Forest. We didn't get to this last part, in which he decried the destruction, torture, and murder of trees perpetrated by private individuals and minor official bodies. The savage sound of the electric saw is never silent wherever trees are still found growing.
Wow.
So obviously, he very highly valued trees and loved them. And the love of trees, and I think sort of the inherent problems of keeping nature alive and enjoying it in a rapidly industrializing world, I think that was something that was really important to Tolkien. And I think I think most people know that. I mean, I think that's why he's continually setting up conflicts like between the wild forest and civilization, like we saw with the old forest attacking the Shire, or between the forest and industry, like we see with Fangorn and Isengard. And while that's different from the idea of characters being lost in a forest that Michael is talking about, I think there is a connection there. Those forests that appear in Tolkien's works are incredible, and they're mysterious and they're scary, because I think Tolkien wants us to be in awe of nature. Now, if you're asking for, any stories like from his childhood or something of him getting lost in a scary forest, I can't find anything like that. This isn't like a Tolkien being bitten by a spider type thing. But
No.
I think it's a general, like I said, I think he just wants us to be in awe of nature.
Yeah, I agree. Now, the role that forests play in Tolkien's work as places to get lost in is best summed up, I think, by that quote from Tom Shippey that we talked about back in episode 112. This is in that essay, Trees, Chainsaws, and Visions of Paradise. And just, again, we only talked about this not that long ago, but it's worth rereading. The literary functions of the wood are, then, first of all, to get lost in, and second, to find your way out of. This makes sense literally, for the main thing about a wood is that you can't see very far. In particular, you can't see the sky, and so you readily lose your bearings, as indeed happens to the hobbits as they make their way through the old forest. But losing your bearings very easily has allegorical meaning, error, moral as well as physical blindness, a sense of despair. So it seems that Tolkien's tendency to have his characters get lost in forests has more to do with his professional knowledge of the role that scary forests play in literature, not any personal fear or experience that he had.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. He's just channeling some of his literary inspirations. And reminds me of another observation we talked about recently by Verlyn Flieger in one of her essays, Tolkien's Wild Men from Medieval to Modern, in which she calls the forest the wilderness outside the boundaries set by civilization. So, yeah, it makes sense for Tolkien to take these civilized characters like the hobbits and place them in a bewildering, mysterious forest, because that's a way of placing them in, another world that's beyond their civilization. It's a place they're not familiar with.
Yeah.
Well, we've got time for one more here, I think, and this comes from Lee B. in Oregon, who wrote in to ask us a question that's relevant to our last episode when we released our keynote from TextMoot.
Oh, yeah.
Lee asked, now that you've both done a moderate and major size convention with MythMoot 5, and Alan attended Oxenmoot, and we've also done a smaller or niche size convention at TextMoot, which would you recommend someone attend for their first Tolkien-themed convention, with the main goal being to get a fair mix of academics, speakers and guests, and sense of community? Lee says, in my experience with Comic-Cons, the smaller ones can be so specific only diehards go or even know the event is happening. On the other end of the spectrum, at major events like New York Comic-Con, there's so much happening that you can easily miss really cool opportunities to learn about artists and topics, or attend panels, or build community with others on mutual interests.
That's true. It may just be a matter of what's possible for you. If you're near a regional moot, for example, there's an LA moot near me, then it's a great opportunity. But I would add that you probably should check the topic and make sure that the area of discussion interests you enough. It is a lot of listening to papers, and if you're not intrigued by that particular area that's addressed by the niche gathering, then maybe it's best to wait either for a different regional moot or for a bigger one. For example, what was the one that we were? It was orality. It was orality in literature. So it was talking about oral storytelling, and it was talking about
Oral
listening
tradition, and
yeah,
exactly, and podcasting and things like that. Obviously, that's interesting to
yeah.
us, and
We would
people
assume
did some
that's
really cool
interesting
things
to
with
you.
that theme. Yeah,
They did.
We
They
hope.
did.
Yeah.
We hope that's interesting enough to you. But I'm trying to remember. I think the LA Moot, the topic was something about adaptations, and that's intriguing. But it wasn't enough for me to drive all the way up to
Not something
to
you're
LA.
personally really gonna.
Right.
Yeah, something you weren't interested in listening to.
If it were
a whole
Orange
day's
County
worth of
Moot, I
talk.
would have gone, right? Because, Corey's there, and I'm sure a lot of people are there that I would have loved to have met. But, it was a Saturday, day at home with the kids, or 4 hours on an LA freeway,
Yeah, and is it worth it to you, especially where you live, to drive a long way?
Yeah.
It's going to really depend on the topic. Yeah, that makes sense.
Exactly. Now, the bigger moots are fantastic. And really, more importantly, they are not huge like a Comic-Con.
No,
Oxen
not at all.
Moot might have had, I don't know, maybe 300 or 400 attendees. Tolkien 2019 is expecting double that. Myth Moot 5 had around 250, maybe 300 tops, as I recall. So they're small enough that you can still have a really great time meeting and making new friends, while also experiencing the academic knowledge on display via the papers, which are usually more general in scope. The only drawback there, and you mentioned this in your question, Lee, is that you can miss out because of the way that panels and tracks are done. You have to choose which papers you're going to hear, and you might miss something because you've had to pick something else. But the people are fantastic. I mean, these are Tolkien fans. So really, no matter which one you choose, it's an amazing experience to be with so many wonderful, like-minded people.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, honestly, at the risk of repeating a lot of things Alan just said, I do agree. I think the smaller regional moots like Tex Moot they're great for meeting people close to home too. I would say
that's true. Yeah,
Texas is a big state, so I did meet a lot of people that I'm not going to be able to go.
Oh,
see
you're
on the
from
weekend
Texas? Yeah, I'm 9 hours away.
Right, exactly. But still, there are people close to home. There's some community there. You're right. They are very focused on themes, certainly the Signum ones, and I think they're probably doing more Tolkien moots than anybody else in the States right now.
Certainly the regional moots, yeah.
Yeah, I do think the themes are usually interesting. I'd say they're always interesting. Even if it's not exactly what you were interested in, there's going to be some interesting things there. And I think one of the things that I thought was fascinating at Tex Moot was some of the topics we got that I wouldn't have thought of as oral tradition or, being on the theme of orality, but that people kind of spun in a way that made a lot of sense. And so you did get some topics that you didn't expect. But, you're right. I mean, you are going to be exposed to a lot of papers on a similar topic. So it should be something you're at least somewhat interested in.
Right.
Even if it's not quite up your alley and that's all that's available to you.
I'd still go.
It still go. Sure. I mean, it's still a smaller, more intimate setting, and there's going to be a lot of opportunity to talk to people and make those connections. And they will mostly be people who live near you. So that's a big plus.
Yeah.
With a larger gathering like Myth Moot, the themes tend to be broader. So you're definitely going to find something there that interests you. There is more programming to choose from, like you said, Alan, and that's awesome. But you also end up having to make some tough choices. I've had to skip one panel that I was sort of interested in just to attend one that I was really interested in.
Same thing happened at Oxenmoot. There were times where I'm picking one of 3 papers to listen to, and it's just I want to listen to all 3 of these.
I know,
but it's just
tough.
the way it is.
It's tough. And, they have to counter program to a certain degree. They,
exactly.
They want to make sure that they get a good spread of people in each room. They don't want, they don't want everybody saying, oh, that's the paper that I want to hear.
Right.
With a few exceptions, obviously the big.
Well,
names.
When John Garth's there, when
John
everybody
Garth
in the
is
room.
there, that's when everybody's going to be in that room.
You certainly don't want to be the guy having to give a paper in the other hall when John Garth's giving it.
And usually they're pretty good about not programming anything against somebody that big. But I think you said this too. Even something like Myth Moot is nowhere near as big as like New York Comic-Con or San Diego Comic-Con.
San Diego Comic-Con is massive,
yeah. Or even like WonderCon, which is like the little sister of San Diego Comic-Con. I used to go to that every year, and it was still huge. Myth Moot's nothing like that.
No, just a few hundred people,
Yeah. And so even though it's a little less intimate than the regional moots, it's still way small enough to get to know people.
Yeah.
I am really curious to see what Tolkien 2019 is going to be like. I think it's going to be quite interesting, quite an experience.
When I talked with Sean Gunner he's the chair of the Tolkien Society. When I spoke with him at Oxenmoot about it, I think he was saying the number was 800 and that maybe they might be able to handle as many as 1,000.
Okay.
So that would be pretty sizable for a Tolkien gathering.
That'll be pretty big, yeah.
Yeah. Though we do know that there are larger gatherings for other Tolkien groups, especially
other
in
parts of the world, yeah.
Yeah.
So anyway, I guess, kind of coming back around to your question, Lee, I would say there's nothing wrong with going to a big moot for your first one, especially a Tolkien-themed moot is going to still be a pretty small, intimate thing.
Yeah.
And even at a bigger moot, Tolkien fans are just some really
just
friendly people, especially
exactly.
for a fan community. It's probably the friendliest. I'll get in trouble for saying that. I think it's one of the friendliest fan communities out there.
I don't know how you could get in trouble for it. I've never been in a fan community that's as friendly as what I've encountered.
Somebody from another fan community is going to think that I'm disparaging another community, and I'm not. I just think Tolkien fans are super friendly.
Yeah, I agree.
And I think you'll fit right in no matter what. But if a smaller moot is easier to access, don't skip it. There's still a lot of fun.
That absolutely is true. Well, folks, that wraps it up for another episode of the Prancing Pony Podcast. Now, please be sure to join us again next week when we discover a cat that can play a 5-string fiddle even when he's tipsy.
Oh, that's a neat trick.
Yeah.
I'm now worried about my cat having access to my son's violin.
I'm more worried about him having access to your booze closet.
There's that too. Yeah. I guess I got some locking up to do before I go on vacation. Folks, thanks again for listening, and thank you for making our common room on Facebook such a fun place to spend time. We want all of you to be a part of this conversation, and it does not stop when the episode ends. See the comments, questions, corrections, and more on Facebook at the Prancing Pony Podcast, on Twitter at Prancing Pony Pod, and on Instagram at Prancing Pony Pod.
And as always, a very special thank you to our patrons at the Kierdance contribution tier, to May in Alaska, James in Virginia, Tamsin in Minnesota, Emily in Texas, and Chad in Texas. Thank you all very much.
Make sure you don't miss any episodes of the Prancing Pony Podcast. Subscribe to the show through iTunes, Spotify, or your favorite podcast app.
And one last thing as always, don't forget to send your thoughts, comments, and most of all, your examples of Tom's review of Bartleman's Inn to Bartleman at theprancingponypodcast.com, and we'll try to get him into our next show. Well, folks, however long we've had, it is still far too short a time to spend among such excellent and admirable listeners. But until next time.
Farewell, friends.